Today I want to continue my series on the Monster Train Clan guides, and for today I want to look at the Melting Remnant as a clan that many people have trouble with playing well, so it's definitely on my priority. So let's go to the logbook and look at their cards, champions and artifacts. Let's start with the champions first. So Melting Remnant has the three champion paths for Rector Flicker, Burn Bright, which has a high stat line, and Burnout 3. Accumulator, which has a relatively low stat line, and Harvest gain plus health. It's 5, 10, 20. And finally Dark Calling, which has a low stat line as well, but has Resolve, Reform 1, 2 or 3 random units. So let's take a look at this. Burn Bright Rector Flicker is definitely meant to be a tanky frontline that dishes out huge damage, but you have to put in some effort to keep him alive. There are a bunch of cards that allow you to do this. There are cards that increase his burnout timers. There's the possibility of reforming him as well. And finally, there's even a card that can entirely remove his burnout for the rest of the combat. He is very strong in the early game if you do have the means to keep him alive, because he starts out with a huge boost in his stats early on. The second upgrade is only a slight addition to that, and the third upgrade finally is another pretty big boost to his stats. So if you start out with a bunch of reform cards or cards that increase his burnout early on, I think this one is a very good pick as your first upgrade. And if you go this path, very often you might want to go it all the way, because the 150-150 stat line is just amazing. Next, let's have a look at Accumulator. Accumulator has relatively low attack, a little bit higher health, and his main benefit is the harvest trigger. Whenever something on his floor dies, no matter for what reason, he gains plus 5, 10 and finally 20 health. This will make him a very tanky unit, requiring almost no attention to keep alive, except for maybe the first one or two waves. But after that, he should gain enough health every just from units dying, that he will be very, very tanky by the time the boss comes around. This is a good path to use with aggressive low HP backline units to protect them, for example. It can also work very well with Umbra's Morsel, because whenever you eat one of them, you will gain the harvest trigger. But the low attack means your damage needs to come from another source. Ragdoll Flicker himself is not gonna provide much damage at all for you. The harvest path can be good, especially with Umbra. It's just kind of a safe pick, because your champion will usually have no trouble staying alive and protect whatever is behind him. Finally, there's the Dark Calling path. He starts with the weakest stat line, and his stats do grow a bit, but he will never be an amazing combat unit himself, but what he does instead is reform units for you. Now this might seem very useful, but the fact that it's a resolve trigger and the target is random is a little limiting. So I wouldn't recommend relying too heavily on the random reforms from Reactor Flicker if you are going for a reform heavy build, but instead try to pick up some targeted reforms as well. I usually like picking him early, but very often you don't need his second or his third form. And if you have some targeted reform cards, it might be better to splash in 1 or 2 levels of Burn Bright instead. The problem with Resolve Reform 3 reform random units is if you put him on the top floor, only the units that die on the top floor are immediately ready to reform when the resolve triggers. The units that die on the lower floor will die after the resolve has already triggered and can be brought back by Rector Flicker the same turn, so they will not be ready to play again in the next turn. If you have Rector Flicker on the lowest floor, that's a bit easier to manage because everything that dies during combat will be available for Rector Flicker to reform. But once the boss comes around, if your power on the bottom floor isn't enough, you can't rely on Rector Flicker's reform to bring back the units that died their combat and redeploy them on the next floor because Rector Flicker will die that way. So very often I'm thinking about how my how many waves of my own units do I need to kill the boss and set up Rector Flicker accordingly. Very often that means I will be putting him in the second floor so I can have access to the units that die at the top or on the middle floor, but I also have the option to, after the relentless combat on the bottom floor resolves, he will have brought back some of the units that died beforehand. Sadly, not those that died during the relentless combat against the boss, but other units that maybe have died before and use them on the second floor to fight the boss. So things like that are very important to consider with Rector Flicker. Another thing is if you're playing on Covenant 10 and above, if you place Rector Flicker on the top floor to reform units, he will be dazed the first turn and will not trigger his resolve for that reason. So if you play Rector Flicker on the top floor and a Draft on the same floor, then usually you would expect him to immediately reform the Draft after it burns out, but on Covenant 10 and above, that will not happen on the top floor the first turn you play them. So something to keep in mind. So let's next take a look at the cards for Melting Remnant. I will once again start with the common cards, mostly because the common cards are cards you will usually have access to in your run, because they are very often offered to you. You can find all the common cards in after defeating a non-major boss. So any combat besides Daedalus and Fel will have these cards in their pool. You can't find these in unit banners, not even Draft, Entombed Explosive and Molten Encasement. You find them all after boss combats. You will also start with 2 of these in your deck if you are playing on Covenant 1 or higher. So these are very important to the basic feel of the clan, I think. Let's start with the base card, Drag. You will always have 3 to 5 of these in your starting deck, depending on the Covenant level you are playing on. and these are zero cost 9/3 units with burnout 2. Now, zero cost, especially important, is also they only take up one capacity. So a zero cost 9/3 that only takes one capacity is actually a pretty decent unit compared to something like a Train Steward. So these tracks are actually quite valuable early on. Their burnout timer of 2 does mean they will become useless quite soon after you play them. They will just die, but these are your early on reform targets as well until you pick up something more useful to reform. And with a bunch of reforms, a drag can become quite a useful damage dealing unit for the early fights. Because they are small capacity and zero cost, you can also easily play them in front of your more vulnerable units to protect them. Sure, the drag only has 3 HP and will die to almost anything that hits them. That's totally fine because these guys are meant to be expendable. Also to consider, other than any other clan's basic card, these basically consume because they are units. Once you've drawn and played them, they will no longer be in your deck, so they are less important to remove from your deck just because you can play them out at 0 energy and they will consume. Sometimes it can be annoying to have tracks in your deck, especially if you are going with random reform cards or do not have the capacity to play them out. But usually, or most of the time, it's fine to keep the tracks in your deck for quite a while and only start removing them very late in the run, if at all. Next up, Hallowed Drippings. Hallowed Drippings is a zero-cost consume card that applies Burnout 3 to all friendly Burnout units on the floor. This is a good way to keep your Burn Bright Reactor Flicker plus any Dregs alive early on in the run. It can also be pretty useful later in the run if you build something like a burnout unit build that wants to actually keep their units alive instead of reforming them, or even if you plan to reform them, you can use this for relentless combat to make sure that your units will actually stay around as long as you want them to. Because remember, burnout counts down every turn. Even during relentless combat, every round of combat burnout will reduce, and when it hits 0, your unit dies. So applying 3 burnout to all friendly burnout units means they can fight for 3 more turns, which is very often enough with their already existing burnout to make them last through an entire round of relentless combat against the boss. That said, this card only adds burnout and does nothing else, so in many cases it is not impactful enough, especially if you plan to reform your units anyways, and they will rack up burnout that way. So next up is Purifying Cleanse. The Purifying Cleanse is a zero cost card that restores 10 health and applies burnout 2 to a friendly unit. It only targets a single unit, only applies burnout 2, but it does not consume, so it can be used repeatedly. It also restores 10 health, so it can be good to top off your frontline burnout units like Burn Bright, Rector, Flicker, or potentially Ladies before a relentless combat, or even just during the fight if you don't plan to reform them just now and want them to stay around a little longer, so maybe you can reform them a later turn, or maybe you are content with their current stats and just want to increase their burnout and keep their health up so they can finish the combat. Purifying Cleanse is decently useful card because it's zero energy cost, but oftentimes it is not amazing because many melting remnant strategies don't really care about their unit's health and would like them to die eventually so they can be reformed for the nice stat buff they get. And also for the full heal that a reform basically provides. Still, Purifying Cleanse is great with Rector Flicker, and it is also great for keeping Burnout up if that's something you need in your deck. So it's a moderately useful card, I think. Next up, Draft. Now, Draft is basically a core unit of the Molding Remnant strategy because it is one capacity, one cost, 10/5 with multi-strike, but it also has Burnout 1. So Draft by itself is basically a spell that costs 1 and deals 20 damage to the front line, but takes 1 capacity. It can also be used as a blocker for your other vulnerable unit, similar to a drag, in case you don't need its damage as much as preventing some damage to your other units. Now, where things get interesting is if you start buffing, reforming drafts, and maybe play a bunch of them on the same floor. With the multi-strike, the damage can really rack up quite a bit. I say Draft is a core unit of many Remnant builds just because it has such good scaling by being one capacity and having multi-strike 1. So let's say you are using Harvest Rector Flicker as your tank, which takes up 2 capacity, and then you have a bunch of drafts behind it. Without any capacity upgrade, you can have 3 drafts behind it, that's 6 attacks already, starting at 10 attack, 10 damage each attack, so that's already 60 attack with all unupgraded basic drafts. Of course, with their burnout, they will require some maintenance by purifying cleanse, hello trippings, but often it is just fine to let them die and just bring them back with one of your reform cards, like the Dark Calling path of your Rector Flicker. If you have Dark Calling, you place down your Rector Flicker, you can immediately place down your Draft on the same floor as the Rector. Draft will burn out the same turn, and then the reform procs with Draft already being ready to be picked. And if Draft is your only dead unit, you can even guarantee it to be reformed and get the nice buff. Next up, Entombed Explosive. Wait, and because one more thing about Draft, just because Draft is so core to any reform strategies and provides so much value thanks to its bulk size and multi-strike, I will pick Draft very highly, and I'm usually happy to have 1 to 3 drafts in my Molten Remnant deck, if I can support them with cards like Hello Drippings or Reform. Next up, Entombed Explosive. Entombed Explosive is one of the Remnant's many tomb units. These are all characterized by having 0 attack and an extinguish trigger. Extinguish triggers when the unit dies, so this is a 1 mana, 1 ember, 1 capacity unit, 0/5. On extinguish, it deals 35 damage to the front enemy unit. So it's basically a spell for most users. You put it down, you expect it to die the same turn. It will prevent some damage to the unit behind it, and it will deal 35 damage to the front enemy unit. That's quite useful. Early on, 35 damage to the front enemy unit is often enough to kill them, or at least enough to make it easy to kill them with any units behind them. So that's quite useful in the early game. Now the problem with Entombed Explosive is that there is no way to scale up the damage it does except for a single artifact. And that makes it a pretty weak pick in my opinion. I'm not sad to have Entombed Explosive in my starting deck, and I might even pick one up very early in the run if I feel like I need some more burst damage directed at the front enemy. You can even have some synergy with the Reform Rector Flicker or any Reform card just to bring it back over and over again and make it deal the 35 damage every time you bring it back. That said, if you reform it too often, it will not die in the lane you place it, and it will take maybe a few turns for it to die, so it becomes a little less reliable that way. But the problem with the Entombed Explosive, as with most tombs, is that it doesn't really scale very well, and late game it becomes rather weak in my opinion. So I try not to pick up Entombed Explosive unless I feel like I really need the front-loaded damage it can provide, or unless I have the one relic that synergizes a lot with extinguish effects, which makes which we will look at later. Uh, in short, the relic doubles the extinguish effect from every unit, so it will make the Entombed Explosive deal 70 damage, and that's good enough to be actually useful in the late game. So if I have said Relic, I might take Entombed Explosive a little higher, but all in all, I think it's a rather weak unit and not the best use of a card in your deck, as well as not the best use of one capacity on your floor. It still does something, so it's not terrible to pick one up either. Next up, this is the second card I consider a core of the Melting Remnant decks. Molded. Molded is a very powerful card. It's a 1 mana spell that reforms a unit. Reforming a unit means you take any consumed unit, whether it died in combat, died to burnout, or you consumed it some other way. There are other ways to consume units. After all, you can bring any defeated or consumed unit back to your hand. They gain burnout 1, they get +5/+5, and they become 0 cost, which I don't need to mention, that's a huge buff. +5/+5 is nice, 0 cost is amazing, and Burnout 1 means that any burnout timer it already has becomes higher. So if you reform a drag, for example, it will become a 14/8 with burnout 3. This is an enhance, so all these buffs stay with the unit for future reforms, for example. So if we reform the drag a second time, it will become a 19/13 with burnout 4. So very often you want to have a molded in your deck to bring back drags early on, drafts as soon as you have them, maybe other units, maybe tombs to trigger their effect another time. Molded is very strong, very flexible. Of course, it's also amazing with the Burn Bright path of your Rector Flicker, bringing back a 60/60 that died as a 65/65 with Burnout 4. That's very good value for a 1 mana card. Very often I will try to cost reduce Molded and give it holdover. We in the beta tester community did have a nickname for that exact upgrade, and it's called Moldover. And it has that nickname for a good reason, and that's because this card is really, really important in almost any Molten Remnant deck focusing around the interactions in this clan. It's just so efficient. And for that reason, and because I value targeted reform very, very highly in this clan, I will almost always pick up the first molded I see over almost anything else most of the time. There are exceptions to this. I did have Melting Remnant decks that didn't play around as reform as much, and then molded might be a little bit weaker, but most of the time it's still worth including at least one molded for emergency situations. A unit dies that you didn't expect to, molded can save you from such situations, or to bring back a unit after you fought the boss and maybe you didn't win, but it was close and you just need one unit you lost again for this final push on the next floor. Molded has your back there as well. If you use Molded in that fashion, you might not need Holdover, but it's often important that you get it at the right time, so Permafrost would be a great upgrade for situations like that. So Molded, in my opinion, one of the most important, most core card to the whole clan. I will almost always pick it up. If I see it early, I will usually pick it up and try to include at least some amount of reform synergy in my deck. Very often with draft. Next up, Molten Encasement. Molten Encasement is a 1 mana, 1 capacity, 2 unit, 0/5 with Extinguish, apply Stealth 1 to friendly units. So whenever the Molten Encasement dies, the units behind the Molten Encasement are safe from combat for this turn. The problem with the Molten Encasement is it only lasts for that turn, and it usually triggers during combat when some enemies have already attacked, so the protection it provides is marginal at least. On top of that, it doesn't interact very well with Reform. If you reform a Molten Encasement, and it has Burnout 1, if it burns out at the end of combat, Stealth will be applied and it will immediately be removed again because combat is over. And that's just an interaction that hurts the overall value of this card a lot. So, to be honest, I never take this card. I don't really see the use in it. Uh, it can protect your entire team for a turn, sure, but Melting Remnant has pretty good ways to achieve something like that already, and it is pretty hard to get value out of the Molten Encasement. So there the only situations where I would consider picking up a Molten Encasement is if I had something like the Wexer Snuffer, the relic that doubles the Extinguish trigger, or maybe a card named Intent on Death, which we will look at later, that will trigger an Extinguish effect without killing the unit. But even then, I am more likely to take other Extinguish units instead of the Molten Encasement. Next up, Wicklash. Wicklash is similar to Purifying Cleanse, a spell that enhances a friendly unit with +5 attack and applies Burnout 2. It costs 1, unlike the Purifying Cleanse, and the effect it gives is an enhance that will stay on the unit even if it dies and gets reformed. So for just that reason I consider Wicklash a little more useful than the Purifying Cleanse. It's a very good way to keep your drafts alive and give them a little bit extra attack to use with their multi-strike. Sometimes you can even use it on units that don't have burnout if you just need that little bit of extra push and don't mind the unit dying later, which is sometimes the case in Melting Remnant decks. Keep in mind this apply burnout 2 is not an enhance. The attack is, but the burnout isn't. So once the unit is dead, it will lose the burnout 2. So if you reform it, you will get the base burnout +1, and these 2 burnout you applied with Wicklash, or also Purifying Cleanse and Hello Tripping, these will be gone. So if you Wicklash a drag and then later reform it, you will have the +5 attack from the Wicklash. So it's a 19-8 with the reform buff, and it will have burnout 3, not burnout 5. So don't count on Wicklash to increase burnout over a long period, over the whole fight. It's more used for the attack buff early, so your reformed units can deal more damage later on even, and it's used late for the burnout increase. If you are shortly before a relentless fight and your unit has burnout 2, you might want to use something like Wicklash to keep it alive for another 2 rounds and make it deal more damage at the same time. In my opinion, Wicklash is the best of these common cards that increase burnout on units, just because it can also be used to increase the attack of your units. If you want to make a strong draft, it isn't a bad idea to put your draft in the front line, put Wicklash on it. It will die to the enemy, so it doesn't matter that it has higher burnout, but you got an additional +5 attack buff onto it for any future reforms you do with that draft. For that reason, I will take Wicklash sometimes. I will take it very highly if I'm running Burn Bright Rector Flicker, because very often I just want to keep the burnout up on that unit. I will also often take it if I run drafts, but sometimes I'm just happy just reforming my units and don't really want Wicklash to buff them up and decrease their burnout, which might increasing the burnout might be a downside sometimes, because you want your unit to die, so you can reform it. But still, I think Wicklash is a very solid card and is quite useful in many Remnant decks. Next up, Dripfall. Dripfall is a 2-mana card that simply descends a unit. Nothing more, nothing less. It is quite useful in some decks and pretty useless in others. It can be used to overstack your floors, but if you have burnout units there and these units die, then you can't replay them on that floor and might need Dripfall again to bring them back there, because if your floor is overstacked, there might not be enough room for them after they die to be played back on the floor. Overstacking is a bit tricky with the uh, melting remnant. By the way, with overstacking, I mean if you have the capacity used on your floor and can't play any more units there, you can still descend units from the next floor above them onto that floor to basically uh, circumvent the capacity limit of that floor. So if you have like a Rector Flicker in your front and then 3 drafts behind, but you want another unit there, you could play your drag, you could Dripfall it down to the floor, and then you have 6 capacity used out of 5. That works. Cards like Dripfall can do that for you. But as soon as your first draft dies, you maybe reform them, and then you might want to play them on the same floor again, but you can't. You would need Dripfall again. So that's a little bit of a problem with descent effects in Molten Remnant. Of course, you can always use it on the enemy, and sometimes it's useful, but most of the time I'd rather ascend my enemies so I can split them apart and take out one of them before the others. With descent, it's a little bit harder to do in my opinion. Still a decent spell, much more valuable if you are aiming for a good score, because this card can do a lot in terms of score for you. For one, against flying bosses, you can control their movement a bit better. So if you have a high damage floor, you can descend them to your high damage floor with Dripfall, so they take the damage again, which can help in getting a flying kill. And the other use is if you are against, if the boss enters the train on the bottom floor and you have set up on the middle floor, then you can just descend your strongest unit to the bottom floor, maybe something like a reformed Rector Flicker with Burn Bright, like let's say a 155, 155, with maybe a bunch of burnout increases with Purifying Cleanse or Wicklash. You drop him down to the boss floor, and he by himself can take out the boss maybe, and then you get one more turn of boss rush, which can be very useful. So for that reason, Dripfall is a lot better in runs where where you are competing for score, like daily challenges or hell rushes, compared to normal battles, where it does have quite a few utility applications, but the 2 cost might make it a little bit hard to use. So, next up, let's look at the uncommon spell cards from Melting Remnant. These cards, again spell cards, can be found after every minor boss battle, every normal combat, so to speak, except for Daedalus and Fel battles, which will always offer rare cards instead. These cards are all spells that can only be found in after combats and never in unit banners, so keep that in mind. First off, Intent on Death. Intent on Death is a 0-cost card that allows you to trigger a unit's extinguish ability without killing it. This has a variety of uses. For one, it can be used on your tombs to trigger their extinguish ability, keeping them around, trigger it again later when they die. That's a it's a pretty nice card that way. If you play it on an explosive, how's it called? Entombed Explosive. If you play it on an Entombed Explosive, this is a 0 mana spell that deals 35 damage to the front enemy unit, which is pretty neat. Nothing insane, but nice to have. There are other cards where it is much more effective because they have stronger extinguish abilities. But there's another slightly non-obvious use to this card. You can also play it on enemies. Well, most enemies extinguish abilities you don't really want to trigger because most of them just deal damage to your front unit. Sometimes they can be useful for killing off something you want to die so you can reform it later. But the enemy you want to play this on most of the time is the Collector, because he has Extinguish, Gain Gold. And yes, you can play that on the Collector and kill it afterward, gain the gold twice, no problem. So that's a nice little upside for Intent on Death. I wouldn't usually pick it just to use it on Collectors, but if I have some tombs in my deck, I might be happy to pick up an Intent on Death, because I can use it on my tombs, but I also can use it to get some gold from the Collectors, which is a nice little benefit. There are 2 rare units where this card is exceptionally useful with, and I will almost always pick it up if I have one of those 2 rare units. We will talk about that once we get to these units. Usually, if I don't have any tombs, I will avoid Intent on Death. If I do have good extinguish units, I might pick it up. It's basically a very binary card in that sense. You pick it if you have good extinguish abilities, and it's worthless without them. Next up, Memories of the Melted. 0 cost consume card that gives you 1 amber for each friendly unit death this battle. This card can generate a lot of amber. And by a lot, I mean I have had combats where this card generated me 35 amber. That, of course, is only useful if you have a way to spend that amber. But just keep in mind that it's a very easy to use way of generating huge amount of embers. The only thing you need is a bunch of burnout units, ideally a bunch of morsels. Memories of the Melted is a Umbra card in disguise, in my opinion. Because Umbra has a lot of X-cost spells, a lot of morsels that die after you play them. Umbra can generate so many unit deaths that Memories of and has so many ways to spend the extra Ember generated that I pick Memories of the Melted very often if I'm playing Umbra Melting Remnant, even if I don't have a plan on spending that Ember just yet. Other than that, it does also work quite well with Hellhaunt. Hellhaunt has a bunch of decent expensive cards like One Horn's Tome, and even the Hellhaunt Spike is pretty good with Memories of the Melted. That said, Memories of the Melted is not the best card for a Remnant focused deck by themselves because Remnant doesn't really have great expensive cards to spend all that Ember on. These very often need to come from your secondary clan. But all in all, Memories of the Melted is a very, very powerful Ember generation engine to fuel single large turns. After all, it has Consume, and it isn't even terrible to remove Consume, put Holdover on it, and then you have all the energy you will ever want after only a few of your friendly units died. That said, very often if I'm playing a Remnant focused deck, I will skip this card just because I don't really have a great use for the extra Ember. Next up, Sacred Wicks. Sacred Wicks is a consume card, 0 cost, and that reforms 2 random units. Basically, it's something like 1 resolve trigger from Rector Flicker. Um, it does consume, and the cards, the units it reforms are random, so it's very limited as your main form of reform. Um, because after all, you can't choose what to bring back, and you can't rely on it in the long term unless you remove consume from it. I don't particularly like Sacred Wicks, but I will pick one up from time to time if I am lacking a consistent way to reform. For example, I have a Molded already, but I don't have Holdover on it, so I might pick up a Sacred Wicks just in case I need to reform something when my Molded isn't ready. It's also a bit more reliable with the random targeting if you have other reform cards, so you don't just stack up all the drags and train stewards in your consume pile, and then you have to rely on getting the exact unit you want. So if you have other reform cards but you think you might need a little more reform, or you have no reform at all but you really want some, then Sacred Wicks is good for you. But as soon as you have something that can consistently reform the units you want, then Sacred Wicks becomes rather unimportant. So this card, for that reason, I will pick up sometimes, but more often than not, I will skip it because I focus on getting a targeted and reusable way to reform my units instead. Next up, Crushing Demise. Crushing Demise is a very unique card. It is a 1 cost spell that kills a random friendly unit and a random non-boss enemy unit. That's a very powerful effect. One thing you need to keep in mind, you don't need to have a friendly unit on the floor you're playing it on, and you don't need to have a enemy unit on the floor you are playing it on. The thing is that it it chooses a random friendly unit, so it's very hard to use on your main floor, and I would only do that if I were very desperate. Maybe if my unit dies anyways to the damage the enemy does, then I might use Crushing Demise, hope it hits a less important unit and hope it hits the high damage enemy unit, but most of the time you will play this either on an empty floor or on a floor that only has expendable units on, or you might even place a unit you want to die on the floor you play Crushing Demise on to get it to die immediately. It has a chance to kill even the most durable enemies. So if you hit something like a Gilded Wing with it, congratulations, you just dealt 190 damage to it for a single ember. That's great. But it can be very hard to use sometimes. And of course, it targets random. So you might kill the 190 health Gilded Wing, but you might also kill the 3 health Light Wing behind it. So it's a risky card if you intend to use it to specifically kill enemies. What it can do if you have something like a sweep unit or spikes or AoE on the bottom floor that kills off all the small jumps, then you can play Crushing Demise on the second floor to kill the big tanks that survive this thing. But of course, by then these tanks are already damaged, so it's a little bit less exciting because you will kill a, a unit that might not be at full health. So I use Crushing Demise. I pick it not that often and mostly use it when I do have units I want to kill off. There are of course things like draft, maybe it has accumulated a big amount of burnout from reforming it, but you want to reform it just one more time, maybe because the boss is showing up in next turn and you don't want its burnout to start running down yet. You'd rather have it die one more time and bring it back next turn when the boss actually is attackable, and might as well pick another +5/+5 up at the same time. In cases like these, Crushing Demise can be very helpful. But all in all, I think it's just a little bit too hard to use to pick it up often. It's more in specific corner case scenarios where I like this card, and in these scenarios it can get really powerful. Next up, Engulfed in Smoke. Engulfed in Smoke is a 1 mana spell that applies Stealth 2 to friendly units. Stealth means they cannot be targeted in combat. They will not be hit by sweep, they will not be attacked in any way. They can be hit by non-attack sources of damage, for example Wild Wings Extinguish trigger that deals 5 damage to the front unit. That will still hit your stealth units, but other than that, things like that, they are basically untouchable. This is a very unique card because it's the only way you can apply stealth to your units over and over again, and it is very powerful with holdover or double stack. If you have holdover on it, you can replay it every turn and your units basically need no tanks because they are always stealthed. And once the boss comes around with holdover, it's stealth 2 every turn, so you will even stack up that stealth. So by the time the boss comes around, you might have stacked up 6, 7 stealth on your units, and the boss can't do anything for the first 6, 7 turns. And by the time they can do something, maybe they are dead. Engulfed in Smoke most notably doesn't stop burnout, so your burnout units will still die in stealth, which is a little bit of an issue in Melting Remnant. It also stops your units from getting attacked at all, so things like spikes won't trigger, things like revenge won't trigger. These are minor drawbacks of stealth, because all in all, I think Engulfed in Smoke is an immensely powerful card that can eliminate the need for defensive units entirely. In Melting Remnant themselves, I don't think that's needed as much, but it is a very strong supporting card for most other clans, except maybe the Awoken. But it is definitely very powerful in Hellhound and in Stygian, and can sometimes also be quite powerful in an Umbra heavy deck. So just because it is such a powerful effect that eliminates the need for defense entirely, I will usually pick up Engulfed in Smoke unless I have a very good defensive plan. If I have a high HP tank unit that I plan to put in front of my units and ways to keep it alive, then I might skip Engulfed in Smoke. But if I don't, it's a very good pickup. As soon as you get holdover or double stack on it, it basically eliminates the need to have strong tanky frontline units for the most part. Keep in mind, if you double stack it, if your deck is pretty large, then you might not draw into it in time, and you cannot quite rely on it for boss combat, because your stealth might be pretty low by the time the boss comes around. So maybe better to hold over it, or just simply put both on it. Why not? Yeah, Engulfed in Smoke, definitely a unique and powerful card. It can be your frontline tank, basically. Um, it prevents the enemy to attack your units, and if you use Engulfed in Smoke as your tank, you get the extra benefit of having the entire capacity on the floor available for aggressive, offensive, high damage units, which can be quite powerful. So, a very strong card here. Next up, Resin Removal. Resin Removal is a very unique card once again. It, it removes all debuff effects from friendly units and all buff effects from enemy units. Now, what is what the effects of this card are depend obviously a lot on what buffs and debuffs there are around. Well, let's look at buffs on enemy units first. There are not that many, but a few ones are key. There is Rage, found on the first, second, and third combat, um, on small units, 1/1 with Rage 2. I don't remember the name, but these come usually in waves of 4 or maybe waves of 3 with a haste conduit behind them. It's very good against these because these become quite useless without their rage buffs. Then there's units with stealth, 8-2 units. I think there are 6-2 in lower covenants. That enter the train with a stack of stealth, so you can't really deal with them on the bottom floor. Resin Removal can take care of these. Most notably, there's also a boss that comes into play with stealth 8, which is that boss's main defensive mechanic and makes them a real pain to deal with unless you lack a strong tanky frontline unit that can survive all the stealth hits this boss is gonna do. If you try to set up on the bottom floor against this boss, you need it has 13 attack, I think, so you would need something like 104 health on your tank, which is very hard to do. But Resin Removal just kills this boss by removing all the stealth, and then he's pretty weak. Other than that, there's another boss that comes in with 10 lifesteal stacks. These are less important to remove. There are units that gain Rage on Slay. you can dispel this rage, but you can also prevent the application by just not giving them any slay, so that's not a big deal. But that's about it for normal units. Now when this comes in very helpful is in trials. If you take spike trials, if you take spell shield trials, resin removal can be your friend. You can dispel a whole floor worth of spikes. You can dispel a whole floor worth of spell shields and then use some damaging spells on them. It also helps, also some other buffs that appear are the damage shield on one of the Daedalus's bombs, spell shield on one of Fel's statues. But where this card shines the most, in my opinion, is against Seraph the Temperant. Seraph the Temperant makes all your units come into play with Sap, and whenever Seraph visits your floor, he will apply Sap 3 to all your units. With Resin Removal, you can just get rid of that Sap, and that's amazing. That's a lot of extra attack for your units. So if I see that I'm fighting Seraph the Temperant as my final boss, I will usually pick up one copy of Resin Removal. Some other uses for Resin Removal are Ember Drain from the Umbra. You can remove Ember Drain from your unit. Keep in mind that you need to be able to pay the Ember cost for Resin Removal to do that. So ideally you play it in the same turn as your Ember Drain card, but if your cost reduces Resin Removal, you might draw into it later and get rid of all the Ember Drain then, and have your Ember back available starting from the next turn. So that's something you can do. Other than that, I don't think there are too many uses for this card. So unless I'm playing an Ember Drain build or I'm fighting Seraph the Temperant, I will rarely pick up a Resin Removal. But in cases you do fight Seraph the Temperant, keep in mind Resin Removal can remove the sap that boss applies and is thus quite valuable. Next up, a Fatal Melting. 2-cost spell that deals damage to all enemy units on this floor equal to 3 times the number of friendly unit deaths this battle. This is a nice chunk of AoE damage to an entire floor, but it does require some setup. You can't really make use of it the first turn, and it might take a while before the damage actually becomes significant. Once again, similar to Memories of the Melted and other cards that scale with friendly unit deaths, this card is a lot better if you play it with Umbra as your other clan, because Umbra generates a lot of morsels which die by themselves and usually can produce a lot more friendly unit deaths than Melting Remnant can. Still, if you need some way to AoE floor, then Fatal Melting is a great card to have. Just keep in mind that it does require some setup. If I have a Fatal Melting and I am not confident I can easily get a bunch of friendly unit deaths early, I will usually upgrade the Fatal Melting with plus 10 magic power, just so I can use it if I draw it early to kill backline units. Yeah. Other than that, I think Fatal Melting is a useful card, not too strong. Unless you're playing it with Umbra, then it can become really strong. It's a way to deal with backline unit in Melting Remnant, which isn't an easy thing to do. Most damage Melting Remnant can do is on the front line, mostly with units. Melting Remnant is a very unit-focused clan. So Fatal Melting can help you deal with backlines, and just for that alone, it's a pretty good card. Next up, Subsuming Blade. Subsuming Blade is a very unique card in that it grows permanently. It's a 2-cost spell with piercing that deals 5 damage by base, but then whenever you make a slay with it, whenever you kill a unit with it, it increases the damage by 3 permanently. So if you see one of these early on, it's usually a pretty decent pickup. Start using it, give it holdover when you can, and by the time you fight Seraph, it might deal 100 damage or something like that. And that's pretty good. It also has piercing, so it's a great way of dealing with any unit that has damage shield, like Daedalus's bombs, or armor, like these zero attack, low health, high armor frontline units that come in some battles. One thing to note is you can also use it on your own units, for example, Drags, if you don't need them, or if you want them to die so you can reform them. Subsuming Blade can slay these units and gain the permanent damage buff from them. So if you don't have an enemy to kill, maybe you kill one of your own units. That said, later on, Subsuming Blade becomes much worse of a pickup because it will not have enough time to grow and get very powerful. But if all you need is a way to deal with backline units, as I've said before, Remnant doesn't have that many ways to do that, then Subsuming Blade can actually kind of still be okay. It's expensive at 2 mana, but it does come with piercing, so you don't need to worry about spell shield, you don't need to worry about armor. So if you need to kill a backline unit in a spell shield trial or in an armor trial, Subsuming Blade has your back. Next up, Wicker Blaze. Wicker Blaze is very similar to a card we've seen before, Molded, except this one is 2 cost, reforms a unit, and enhances it with an additional plus 10 attack. I think the plus 10 attack for the extra Ember cost is worth it. I will usually pick up Wicker Blaze if I can, if I am playing Reform. But if by the time I see the Wicker Blaze I already have a holdover molded and maybe another molded without holdover in my deck, then maybe I do have enough Reform and skip it. But if I see a Wicker Blaze early, then I'm very happy to take it. This plus 10 attack come in really handy. In total, the unit reformed will get plus 15 attack, plus 5 health, and will become 0 cost. So that's a very good deal. Especially if you have something like a Draft in your deck. After all, these guys have multi-strike. So the additional plus 10 attack you get from Wicker Blaze become plus 20 damage. I think Wicker Blaze is overall a little bit stronger than Molded, but I wouldn't say it's a core card in Remnant deck just because it's an uncommon and not as reliable to get as Molded. But if you see Wicker Blaze first, I would generally try to pick the Wicker Blaze. That said, it is definitely a very strong card, and sometimes I like to pick it up even if I do already have a great way of reforming my units, just so that when I draw into the Wicker Blaze I can get these additional plus 10 attack, but other than that keep reforming my units with Molded to save the Ember maybe. So Wicker Blaze I think is a very strong card and I definitely like to pick it up. Next up, Mortal Entrapment. Mortal Entrapment is a 3 mana spell that deals 25 damage to a unit that is already damaged and applies Taste 2 to them. So they will be unable to attack for 2 turns, but they will still ascend in floors. I think this card is rather weak. The fact that the unit already needs to be damaged makes it very hard to use properly. You can't really use it as well on non-flying bosses. Flying bosses will often take some damage somewhere along in the fight, so it's not terrible against them because it buys you 2 free turns. But if you want 2 free turns against a boss, I would suggest you take an Engulfed in Smoke instead, because Model Entrapment with its 3 cost is very prohibitive. What this can do that Engulfed in Smoke can't is it can daze an enemy that's about to enter your pyre on the top floor. They are most likely already damaged if they managed to reach the top floor. So you can use Mortal Entrapment there, deal 25 damage, they will and apply Daze 2. They will lose one of the dazed before they go up to the pyre room, but then they will be dazed for 1 turn and take damage to the pyre once before they start attacking it. That said, I don't think it's worth taking the card almost ever. Just keep in mind it has some uses if you have it in your starting deck, but maybe you might want to remove it if you think the 3 Ember cost is too prohibitive to play it. I will almost never pick up Mortal Entrapment because it is just a bad way of solving any problems you might have. You can't use it to kill backline units because they need to be already damaged, and most backline units, when they are damaged, they are already dead. You can use it against frontline units, but not on the floor. You start first dealing damage to them, so you can't really prevent them from attacking your floor, and it's a bit hard to use against non-flying bosses as well. So it is very limited in application, and it's an expensive spell on top of that, so I would recommend that you skip this card whenever you see it. Next, let's look at the uncommon units in Melting Remnant. First up, we have Lady of the House. A 1 cost 2 capacity 25-40 unit with Burnout 3. Now 25-40 is a very juicy stat line for a 1 cost 2 capacity unit, so that's already pretty appealing. The downside is that it comes with Burnout 3, so it needs some effort to be kept alive. On the other hand, if keeping her alive is not your main priority because you do have a reliable source of reform, then she becomes very good. Just need to keep in mind, and that's something that goes for most Melting Remnant unit, think ahead what the burnout timer is gonna be when you enter Relentless. Count the waves until the boss. First 2 combats have 2 waves, 1 break, then the boss. Daedalus, if I remember it correctly, has 6 waves, no break, then the boss. After that there are 4 waves, 1 turn of break, then the boss. Fel, if I remember it correctly, but I might be wrong here, has 7 waves, then the boss. No break there. Then the final combat before Seraph has, if I remember that correctly, I might be wrong here, I think 6 waves, a respite, then the boss. And finally, Seraph has 8 waves, then the boss, with no rest before the boss. These numbers are out of memory. I'm not 100% sure on them, so take them with a grain of salt. If you are playing Remnant a lot, you might want to keep notes on that and count the turns until the boss shows up. Because if your burnout is at 1 once the boss shows up, you might be in trouble. Your unit will die after the first turn of combat, then combat will end, and you don't have time to reform her in between during the relentless combat or increase her burnout. So if you are mainly relying on burnout units and just have them burnout naturally, reform them, that might be a bit tricky if you are not paying close attention to when the boss combat starts. You can manipulate that, of course, if you play the Lady of the House um, so that it has one burnout when the boss shows up. You just play her on the middle floor, then she will burn out the turn the boss enters the middle floor, and you can reform her and play her with her full new burnout value +1 on the middle floor again and be ready for the boss combat. That goes for not just for Lady of the House, but for most burnout units in the Melting Remnant. Plan ahead, plan your burnout counter around the boss. It's very important. That is a lot of work to do, I am aware, but these units can really reward you for doing that because Lady of the House has a great stat line for a 2 capacity 1 cost unit. I will mention that again. If you add something like multi-strike to her, that's a really good DPS unit. If you want her to be a tank, you can have her be a tank just at a Hearthstone. And she has 65 health. She will probably survive the 3 turns she takes to burn out. Then you reform her, she gains another 5 health, another 5 attack, and is back with her full burnout, plus even 1 additional 2 due to the reform. I really like Lady of the House because of her high stat line, especially in the early game. It makes things a lot easier, but she does require support from your deck, and she does require you to play carefully and plan ahead. I think that's worth it, so I would rate Lady of the House rather highly. Next up, Lady of the Reformed. Lady of the Reformed is a very unique unit because she has the effect revenge-friendly burnout units gain burnout 1. Other than that, she's a 1 mana 2 capacity 1040 burnout 3, so she's definitely kind of a tank unit, especially with the revenge ability, and her strength is that units behind her usually don't need to care about their burnout timer. You can play drafts, you can play Lady of the House behind her, and every time she gets hit, she herself and everyone behind her will increase their burnout by 1, which makes it really easy to keep these units alive during combat and during boss combat. Just keep in mind, if it's a not a major boss combat, a normal combat in between bosses, there will be one break with no enemy spawning, and this usually means that your units will burn out that turn, so just keep that in mind. It can be a problem if some units die during the rest due to burnout because Lady of the Reformed does not get hit. Um, this ability also means that she's only gonna do this burnout applying thing if she actually gets hit, actually takes damage. Of course, you can use spells yourself, like Subsuming Blade or maybe a Torch if you're playing with Hellhorn to trigger the revenge in case you really need it. But most often, if you kill all enemies before they come to Lady of the Reformed, she won't be very good. A 1040 stat line is acceptable uh, for a 1 mana 2 size unit. Not amazing, but solid for a defensive frontline unit, which she definitely is. If you just want to use her as a defensive frontline unit, you can do that because she does increase her own burnout with the revenge. Even if there are no burnout units behind her, you can still use her as a tank. And while I wouldn't usually do that, it can be useful to have this option sometimes. Very useful. She's also very useful if you have her on one floor and fight on other floors mostly, and then after you've reformed your units enough, you put them behind your Lady of the Reformed so they stay alive due to her revenge trigger. So for that, Lady of the Reformed, a very special unit that can help your burnout decks play a lot differently than they usually would. That's definitely something that's nice to have, and I think she's quite powerful. I will pick her up if I need a frontline tank, if I am going with a burnout heavy strategy and maybe want to keep my drafts alive after I've reformed them once or twice. Something like that works very well with the Lady of the Reformed. Next up, Paraffin Enforcer. 1 energy, 2 capacity, 15/15 unit with the ability Strike. Friendly burnout units gain Rage 2. Now, 15/15 is not exactly an amazing stat line, but it's not exactly useless either. So Paraffin Enforcer at least brings some stats to the table. But with these stats, the main focus needs to be on the ability, obviously. Strike friendly burnout units gain Rage 2 means that whenever they attack an enemy, your burnout units will gain stronger, but Rage is not carried over with Reform. So it's only while they stay alive that the Rage is actually doing something. Furthermore, Rage decreases by 1 each turn, so Paraffin Enforcer is very slow in stacking up Rage, unless you give it something like Multi-Strike. With Multi-Strike it will strike twice, apply 4 Rage a turn, and suddenly the Rage stacks up quite quick. 3 a turn, you gain 4 and you lose 1, so that's a pretty solid gain. 3 Rage a turn is 6 attack. It could be quite powerful behind something like a Lady of the Reformed, um, because then your burnout units stay alive and you can stack up the rage. Something else you can do is give Paraffin Enforcer a large stone, so it strikes first. Because it's in the front, you can use it because it has enough health that way to be a front line, and then it strikes first when it's in the front, and all your burnout units behind it will actually gain the benefit of the rage this turn. So it's a bit better that way. Also, if you are using it, put it directly behind your tank and your other burnout units behind the Paraffin Enforcer, so they benefit from the rage that turn. Something like a draft that gains rage 2 for the turn will deal 8 extra damage, so that's quite valuable. That said, Paraffin Enforcer, to be really worthwhile, requires a lot of setup. It will require something to keep your burnout units alive. It will require multi-strike to be really good, and it will also require additional capacity so it can hit multiple burnout units at the same time. So that's a lot of setup involved, but if that's what you want, that can be your game plan. You can have a Lady of the Reformed with a Paraffin Enforcer behind it, and maybe 2 drafts behind the Paraffin Enforcer, give the Paraffin Enforcer multi-strike, maybe even put something like a Whiplash on your Paraffin Enforcer, so uh, it has burnout itself and buffs rage onto its own stats. That will make it a lot more powerful, especially if you buffed it with multi-strike. And if you have that whole setup behind the Lady of the Reformed, the burnout on the Paraffin Enforcer is usually not going to be a problem, because Lady of the Reformed will keep up that burnout. I had runs where I just had a Lady of the Reformed, a Paraffin Enforcer with multi-strike, and a bunch of burnout units behind them, and that worked out really well. They can just scale the rage quite high until the boss shows up, and it's pretty strong. So Paraffin Enforcer is, in my opinion, mostly a build-around card you want for single strong burnout floors to buff them up. burnout floors that also stay alive, not something that you reform over and over again because the rage falls off when the unit dies. So definitely a build around card, but if you are in a build that supports this, then Paraffin Enforcer can be your main damage scaling. Next up, Paraffin Tuck. Paraffin Tuck is a 1 energy 2 capacity 23 unit with Slay, gain 20 gold, 20 coins. That is a pretty interesting effect. Gaining gold makes your deck stronger overall over the course of the run. So Paraffin Thug has a pretty weak stat line with 23, and it definitely needs protection, and it needs something to kill the frontline unit so that it can trigger its lay against weaker backline units, or at least something that weakens the frontline so it can get the slay on the frontline unit. I've had runs with multiple Paraffin Tucks with multi-strike, generating a bunch of gold with something like a Burn Bright flicker in front of it to kill off the front enemy unit that's very tanky. And that works out pretty well. These Paraffin Thugs, they do require upgrades if you want them to be able to deal significant damage later on, but very often they also pay for their own upgrades. Because over the course of a run, a Paraffin Tuck can easily generate you 200, 300 gold. So I will usually pick up a Paraffin Tuck if I see one very early, because the earlier you pick it up, the more time you have to generate gold with it. It's definitely made as a backline unit with its stat line. The damage it provides isn't major, but it's not terrible either. It's actually somewhat useful just as a backline unit early on. Definitely 20 damage will not cut it for the late game for a backline unit, so you will need to upgrade, but at the very least Paraffin Thug can generate the gold you need to upgrade it. As said, a good card to pick up early falls off if you get it later because it just won't have enough time to generate a lot of gold if you pick it up late. Very interesting, very unique unit, something that only Remnant can do, generate gold during fights. Next up, Remnant Host. Remnant Host is a 1 capacity, 1 mana, 1 ember, 2 unit, 0/5 stats with the Extinguish Summon 2 draft units. Now, every other unit we've seen here can only be found in unit banners and will never be in normal card rewards. Remnant Host is the only unit on this page that is actually in normal combat rewards and never in unit banners because it's a tomb unit. Actually, no, there's another one. Devourer is also a card that can only be outside of unit banners. Remnant Host is an interesting card in that it summons 2 draft units when it dies. These draft units are Waxers, have Burnout 1 and Multi-Strike 1, 10/5. The normal draft units you get, you can pick as a common card, this one, and it will spawn 2 of those. I find this card very hard to use, but it's basically a better Entombed Explosive. It deals 40 damage if it dies, because the draft units will be able to attack immediately after they spawn, unless it dies to like the first hit and then the backliners kill off the drafts. Then it's more of a then it functions more like a Molten Encasement, protecting your backline instead of dealing damage. So in that regard, it's somewhat flexible, but it can be a bit hard to control what it actually does, because you need to make sure it dies, the drafts don't die when you want the damage, and you need to make sure and if you want to protect, you can put it in the front and have the drafts take the damage. So it's a bit difficult to use. One thing to note is that these draft unit, it spawns, they are cardless. They will not go into the consume pile when they die. They will instead just vanish. So that means these draft units will not be available to reform. You can, however, reform the Remnant Host itself, but that doesn't mean the draft units are gonna be any stronger. And draft units, while they are pretty nice, are very often units you want to buff because they have multi-strike. There are one capacity, buffs on them scale very well. But that's very hard to do with Remnant Host. In fact, the only way I can think of is having them having a Remnant Host die to a sweep unit when it's behind a Lady of the Reformed. And otherwise, these drafts will almost always just die right away after they have dealt their damage. So I will pick up Remnant Host very rarely. It's an uncommon, so you see it less commonly than an Entombed Explosive, but it can do a very similar job as an Entombed Explosive. It also scales very well with their artifact that makes your Extinguish trigger twice. When it summons 4 draft units, then it might be quite powerful, but you need to have the capacity for that. Not the capacity. You need to have the unit. There's a unit limit on the floor. There can be a maximum of 7 units on on a given floor at any time. So if you have 3 other units beside the Remnant Host, that's fine. It can spawn the full 4 drafts it spawns, but if you have any more than that behind the Remnant Host, it will reduce the amount of drafts it spawns. For these reasons, and because these drafts aren't really able to scale at all, I don't pick Remnant Host that often, but it can be useful early in the game, especially if you can reform it just to deal a bunch of damage to a single unit. It's a little bit better than Entombed Explosive in my opinion, and quite a lot better than Molten Encasement, but still not that great of a unit. I will more often than not avoid picking up Remnant Hosts. Next up, Votivary. Votivary is a 1 mana card, a 1/1 unit, the weakest unit in the game, endless, and has Extinguish draw 1. Well, the weakest unit in the game you can put into your deck, together with Imps, in that regard. It has endless, so whenever it dies, it goes on top of your deck. You will draw it again next turn, and it draws you a card when it dies. So it basically pays for the card itself, and it only costs you the Ember. But it doesn't really bring much value to the table. The only thing you can really use it for is to up your count of friendly unit deaths and to just block for more important units. And to be honest, there are much better ways to do that in Remnant. Your basic drafts can do that and they don't cost you any Ember. It's a lot better if you can remove the Ember cost, for example with reforming it, although that will be quite difficult to do because it has endless. Or if you have the artifacts Forever Flame that reduces the cost of all your units. Uh, by 2. So when do you actually pick Votivary? I don't really know, to be honest. I almost never pick this card, and if I have it in my starting deck, I will keep it around for a while, but eventually remove it. I don't really see Votivary as very good, but it becomes a bit better if you do have the Waxer Snuff for the artifact that uh, adds that increases the extinguish, doubles the extinguish effect of your units. So then suddenly it can be card draw for you whenever it dies. So that might be something to keep in mind if you have a Votivary offered. Um, Other than that, there is in theory an infinite combo with Votivary and Vexor Snuffer and the relic, the Forever Flame. Um, if you also have a zero cost way to get rid of it, and then you can just, if you have your whole deck in your hand, and let's say you have a Votivary and a Cannibalize, then you can generate infinite morsels. Now eventually your hand will be full of morsels and your floor will be full of morsels, but who knows? Something like that could have a use, especially if you're using harvest units, for example. Um, Maybe there are other ways to achieve that. For example, with Razor Sharp Edge. You can play Razor Sharp Edge on Votivary infinite times, trigger Harvest a lot, and eventually your Votivary will be huge. But that infinite combo requires two uh, very specific artifacts and a small deck because you need to draw into the Votivary again over and over again. I think it also requires two Votivary because the Votivary can draw itself. Intent on Death is also an option to use Votivary. You can use Intent on Death to draw a card. Usually not the best use of Intent on Death, but if you have no other extinguishers around, that's something you can get out of the Votivary. Well, all that means Votivary is very situational and very rarely deserves a spot in your deck, but it does definitely have some interesting interactions with other cards. I personally almost never pick it. Next up, Wickless Baron. Wickless Baron is a 2 capacity, 1 energy unit, 515 stats, and harvest, gain +1 attack and +3 health. Harvest triggers quite often because it not only triggers from your units dying, it also triggers for each enemy that dies. So if you have a powerful killing floor with the Wickless Baron, every enemy that dies on that floor will grant the Wickless Baron +1/+3. And if you feed it a bunch of morsels, every morsels will give it +1/+3. So it's similar to a Gorge unit in that regard. Um, So Wickless Baron is a decent card, I think. The +3 health it gains on Harvest means it will generally build up quite a lot of health, but it can sometimes be a bit annoying to use as a frontliner because things need to start dying before the Baron becomes tanky. Once it has acquired enough buffs, though, it can be very powerful. Um, it's pretty difficult to evaluate Wickless Baron in my opinion. Um, it can be a frontliner if you have the support to keep it alive for the first 1 or 2 turns and actually kill things or feed it morsels. It can be a backliner if you have the power to kill a lot of things, have some units of your own die. It can be become a decent boss killer basically. But other than tank and boss killer, it has a hard time doing much. Of course, the 5 attack is enough to kill most backlines after you've gotten rid of the front lines, so it can be a good supplement to something like a Burn Bright, Rector Flicker in the front line. Things like that are possible, but all in all, I think Wickless Baron is a mediocre card. Um, There are much better units to use as a frontline, like Lady of the Reformed or even Lady of the House, if you can support them. And Wickless Baron only really shines in Umbra decks, where you can actually have morsels on the same floor, which makes it grow a lot faster. And these morsels can also provide additional attack, because if you just grow it with Harvest, it will gain a lot of health, but the attack gain is relatively slow. Still, Harvest triggers relatively often, so you can expect your Wickless Baron to grow quite a bit if you focus on Harvest in a Molten Remnant non-Umbra deck. You can expect it to get like 20, 30 triggers out of it, depending on your exact deck, and then it's a pretty sizable unit by the time the boss comes around, but probably not enough to take on the boss on their own. So I mostly see it as a great unit in Umbra builds if I want a floor where I have a bunch of harvest units and morsels, for example. That said, Wickless Baron can still serve as a backliner in some situations. It will probably eventually grow out the damage, grow big enough to deal more damage than something like a Paraffin Tuck if you manage to get many kills on its floor. So it's not that bad. Yeah, that's about it. Um, Very often I will skip on Wickless Baron and take another unit instead, but it can be good, especially with Umbra. Next up, Wickless Tycoon. Similar to the Wickless Baron, this one has a Harvest trigger and pretty mediocre stats. It's a 1 energy, 2 capacity, 320 unit, which it's definitely not great. And it has Harvest gain 5 gold. Now this is a very interesting effect because if you use it with just enemies dying, you can expect maybe 50, 100 gold a battle. That's not too bad. But if you add your own drafts and drags dying, and especially if we start adding in Umbras with morsels, this guy can generate a ton of gold. He can easily generate like 100 to 200 gold a battle in an Umbra deck with a lot of morsels, plus getting enemy kills. That's pretty good. That's a lot of gold. So Wickless Tycoon can be worth it. If you want to use it as an actual combat unit, I suggest putting a Heartstone or two on it and use it as a frontliner where it can soak up damage, give you some gold for kills you get on the floor, maybe see some drafts or drags or morsels die, generate some more gold, and perhaps later it dies, and you put one of your reformed cards from another floor, maybe a lady of the house, on that floor to fight the actual boss. Something like that can work out well. Similar to Paraffin Tuck, I will pick Wickless Tycoon much more often early on in the fight, in the run, so I do have time to benefit from its harvest effect. It is a lot. It is a bit less reliant on upgrades than a Paraffin Tuck because it just needs to see the unit die to gain the gold and not get the killing blow on them. So it can generate a lot of gold early on, and maybe you can just cut it later. Maybe pays for its own removal plus some some more, plus you get to keep some more gold. Things like that are definitely possible with Wickless Tycoon, and I think it's a quite a decent card because of that reason, even though overall I think Paraffin Tuck is a little better in the gold generating business. I think Wickless Tycoon might generate a little bit more gold per combat, but Paraffin Tuck can actually provide some combat utility as well by being a damage dealer behind your units, which Wickless Tycoon can't really do, and using it as a tank might work, but is also not an amazing. He's not an amazing tank. So that's it for the uncommon units of Melting Remnant. Let's go over to the rare spells next. These rare cards, these rare spells can be found after combat. After normal combats, they can rarely appear in the spell rewards you get to choose from, but there will always be guaranteed three rare cards to choose from. They can be spells or units after you beat Daedalus and Fel. These cards can be very unique, have very powerful effects sometimes. So let's look at the first one, Waxen Spike. Waxen Spike is an X-cost consume card that enhances friendly units with plus 3x attack and applies Burnout 1. Unlike something like Hello Drippings, this will apply Burnout 1 to all units, no matter whether they already have Burnout or not. So Wax and Spike can be a bit hard to use, because you might give Burnout to a unit that doesn't want it. Also, plus 3x attack is not that much if you only hit a single unit with it, but if you hit a wide floor of drafts with it, that can add up to a lot of damage. Wax and Spike is at its best in a deck that uses a bunch of burnout units behind something like a Lady of the Reformed that increases their burnout timer. Maybe even with a Paraffin Tuck. So you apply burnout to the Paraffin Tuck and he starts giving himself rage as well. A deck like that definitely benefits from Wax and Spike. It's also great if you have just a bunch of drafts to hit with the Wax and Spike, or if you have Rector Flicker with Burn Bright as a tank for your drafts, then Wax and Spike is relatively useful. Obviously, it has a huge synergy with Memories of the Melted. Memories of the Melted gives you the energy to use for your Wax and Spike, and then maybe you can play a Wax and Spike for 10 or even 20 Ember, which is 30 or 60 attack to the entire floor. That's a lot. But otherwise, if you are not focusing on a single burnout floor, if maybe your tank is Harvest Flicker, for example, or if you have something like a Paraffin Tuck as your DPS behind your burnout units, or if you just have something like a Paraffin Enforcer behind a tank unit that isn't Lady of the Reformed, then suddenly Wax and Spike becomes a lot worse, because it will apply burnout to your non-burnout units. It's also quite difficult to use if you are using units of any other clan because of the same reason. There are a few units that don't mind having burnout applied to them, like imps or morsels. So that might be okay. Tombs also usually don't mind having burnout applied to them. So all in all, I'm not in a full burnout build often enough to regularly pick Wax and Spike, but when I am definitely happy to see it. Next up, Sacrificial Resurrection. This card is a bit complicated, but it's pretty amazing and very unique. It's a zero cost card that consumes all cards in your hand and adds a draft unit to your hand and enhances it with plus 10 attack for each card consumed. First off, this card doesn't consume itself. It goes into your discard pile and only consumes the cards afterwards. The draft unit is a normal draft unit you can draft, including the cost of 1 Ember. Don't forget to keep 1 Ember left over if you intend to play the draft after you play your Sacrificial Resurrection. Finally, units that are consumed by Sacrificial Resurrections are available to reform immediately. So that might also be interesting. Other cards you consume with Sacrificial Resurrection can only be returned by cards that actually return consumed cards, something like a Imp Scholar. Now, Sacrificial Resurrection, in my opinion, is a very strong card because it can get rid of Blights, it can get rid of Scorches, it can get rid of Train Stewards, it can get rid of basic cards you don't want anymore. If there is a card in your hand that you don't want to draw into anymore, use Sacrificial Resurrection on it and convert this useless card into a +10 enhance for a draft unit. Now, unlike the draft units from the Remnant Host, the Sacrificial Resurrection draft unit is not cardless, so it is available to reform. And if you have a draft with, let's say, +40 attack, that's a 50 damage multi-striker available to reform. That's amazing. That's a ton of damage. For all these reasons, I pick Sacrificial Resurrection very often. I pick it more often even and really see it as a premium card in high covenants when you start with more basic cards and when you start with dead weights, and especially good against the spell consume Seraph because it can get rid of blights, it can get rid of scorches, and the spell consume Seraph has them both. It's also amazing against Scorch Fell because Fell will put a lot of Scorches into your hand. Her own Scorches are not even placed into your deck, they are added directly to your hand, so she actually helps you make bigger drafts with Sacrificial Resurrection. And the draft units you get from this card are huge. They are oftentimes 50, 60 attack, and these drafts can easily kill a frontline unit like that. Afterwards, you can reform them and have huge drafts to kill the boss with. So, for that reason, I think Sacrificial Resurrection is one of the strongest cards in the Melting Remnant pool. It's a bit hard to play multiple times sometimes because your deck will get smaller and smaller. You will have less cards you don't care about in your deck that you can actually burn with Sacrificial Resurrection, but that's usually not a big problem. Yes, you draw Sacrificial Resurrection and it might be a dead draw, but you don't draw your dead weights, you don't draw your basic spells, you don't draw your train stewards, you don't draw your situational cards that you don't need in this combat anymore. So you actually draw a lot more valuable card after you've played a good Sacrificial Resurrection. And for these two reasons, the fact that it makes your draws more valuable and the fact that it adds a huge powerful draft to your hand and later to your reform options makes this card really, really strong. And I am almost never sad to have one Sacrificial Resurrection in my deck, no matter the direction my deck is taking. Next up, Wickless Recruitment. Now this is a very unique card in that it removes all burnout from a unit, and also as a little side benefit it also removes all debuff effects. It's 0 cost on top of that, so it's definitely a very powerful effect for its cost, but it's pretty niche because oftentimes when you use burnout units, you already have a plan to deal with the burnout. Maybe you reform them, maybe you use Lady of the Reformed, maybe you use Hello Drippings, things like that. You often have a plan how to deal with your burnout already when you see Wickless Recruitment for the first time. Because it's a rare. You will usually find it after Daedalus or after Fel, and other than that, it's not gonna show up very often. So, what is this card useful for besides just removing burnout from your Rector Flicker, for example? You can reform units without burnout. something like something like Hornbreaker prints or any unit outside of Remnant, to be honest, and even some units from Remnant. You can reform them, you can play them, and play Wickless Recruitment on them, and you don't have to worry about their burnout anymore, because it's gone. You can also use it in Umbra decks that use Ember Drain, just to remove the Ember Drain effects, similar to Resin Removal. It also gets rid of some other debuffs like Sap and things like that. But mostly it's to remove burnout. Oftentimes oftentimes you will use this just to bring back some single burnout units and maybe remove the burnout for the relentless combat, and that's fine. That said, it is a very situational card, and I don't pick it up all that often because usually by the time I see it, I have a plan to deal with burnout on my units, and I do have maybe only very few non-burnout units that I don't really plan on dying anyways. So picking up Wickless Recruitment just as a contingency plan to bring them back and maybe remove the one burnout they come with. That means I even need to have the Wickless Recruitment in the same hand. So yeah, it's very niche, it's only really useful in very specific circumstances, but in those circumstances it can have a very powerful effect by removing the burnout entirely and not having to care about it anymore. Next up is Remnant Pact. Remnant Pact is a one-cost consume card that applies Endless to a friendly unit. Now, Endless means that when the unit dies, it is returned to the top of the draw pile. And this can be very useful in some situations to put on your tank if he's about to die. If you're not using a burnout tank, that might be more useful than reforming said tank, because otherwise they will come back with burnout 1 and they will not be great tanks with low burnout values. So Remnant Pact can help in these situations. Other than that, I sometimes put it on champions specifically, because champion units can't get the endless upgrade from a unit shop. So the only way to get endless on them is Remnant Pact, in fact. But to be honest, I don't rely on endless a lot. I often prefer to keep my units alive some other way, but it can certainly be viable to use it on your tank and just heal your tank back to full by having them die. Just keep in mind that you might have to specifically let them die shortly before boss combat so they come back with full health in the boss combat. So Remnant Pact can be useful in some specific situations, but again, similar to Wickless Recruitment and Wax and Spike, it's a very situational card. It allows you to ignore uh, healing or other defensive mechanics to a degree, but you still need to be your front line to be tanky enough to deal with relentless combat, because after all you can't replay them during relentless after all. So next up, Memento Mori, a 3-cost card that deals damage to the front enemy unit equal to 10 times the number of friendly unit deaths this battle. That can be quite a lot of damage to the front enemy unit, but it is 3 cost and it does require setup, so it better be amazing. And most of the times, sadly, it isn't amazing. For it to be really good, you need, let's say, 10 units to die, which can be a lot to ask for in a normal Remnant deck. So it does require a lot of setup to actually be strong enough to kill enemy frontliners right out of the bat. So, it is a lot stronger as most of these cards that care about the number of friendly unit deaths in battle with Umbra, because Umbra can easily get 10 friendly unit deaths by turn 3, for example. And that makes Memento Mori a pretty powerful card in these situations. Outside of Umbra, I would very rarely ever pick this card. Maybe if I had something like Endless Imps that also die a lot, but generally I stay away from Memento Mori. I think the Fatal Melting is much more useful because the Fatal Melting doesn't need to get to reach such high damage value to be useful, while Memento Mori really needs high damage to actually be useful because it explicitly hits the front enemy units, and enemy frontliners are usually quite tanky. For that reason, I pick Memento Mori very rarely, unless I'm playing Umbra as my second clan. Now, finally, let's look at the rare units. In my opinion, this is where a lot of the pure power of Melting Remnant lies. You might have a consistent game plan of reforming your units and solid statted units and things, but what really, the cards that can really spiral out of control are a lot of these rare units. Let's start with Bounty Stalker. This is a 1 cost 2 capacity unit, 10-5 stats. It comes with Stealth 1 and has Extinguish plus 10 attack permanently. Permanently meaning it carries over between battles. It also has stealth, so it guarantees that it can attack every combat, because it won't be targeted the turn you play it, and then it can attack, then it loses stealth, and with the 5 health it is very likely to die after that unless you play it behind other units. But you want it to die, because it gets stronger every time it dies. So what I often do with this card is put Wickstone on it. That's a shop upgrade that gives it +5/+5 and burnout 1, just so it dies by itself, and I don't need to make any effort to have it die. Then I will reform it a couple of times. Multi-strike is very good on it because it will get a high attack value, and by the time I reach Seraph it has 200 or even 300 attack. Then another thing you can do with it is put Endless on it. Also very nice with the Wickstone upgrade or any other source of burnout. It will die and just be put on top of the deck, and you can play it next turn and it will die again, stacking up these extinguish triggers. It's also a good target for Intent on Death, which triggers a unit's extinguish without killing it, so we can gain attack more than once a turn that way, because you can trigger its extinguish without having it die, then it still dies to burnout or to combat. In my opinion, Bounty Stalker is the single strongest unit card in the game if you find it early. If you find it after Fell, I think it's still after the Fell combat, it's still a pretty good unit to pick up, but not amazing. It will more be like a good damage spell. Something like very similar to a Subsuming Blade that grows every time you use it, but it grows a lot faster, but can only target frontline units, and it does require some upgrades. But that's fine. That's, in my opinion, still a very reasonable card to pick. If you pick it on Daedalus or even before Daedalus from a unit banner, then this card becomes absolutely insane, totally broken, and will carry the game by itself by the time you reach the late game. You will still need a functioning deck to get you through the early game, but by the time you reach Fel, you can probably cut most of the other cards from your deck and just rely on Bounty Stalker sniping everything, especially if you have Wickstone and Endless or Wickstone and Multi-Strike on it. It's also a very strong card to pick up in any scoring run because it has a huge potential to kill bosses by itself during flight because the damage it deals is so high. And if you go for a Bounty Stalker build, please don't have just one Bounty Stalker. Once it has grown to like 150 attack, maybe 200 attack, go to every Hellbent, dupe it as often as possible. So you can have like 3 Bounty Stalkers by the time Seraph comes around and have them at 300 attack with Multi-Strike. That will melt everything. So, Bounty Stalker, if I see one, I will usually pick it. Maybe I won't pick it if I see it very late, but I might still do it because it can still grow to a size where it is actually reasonable to use. After all, the later combats are longer, so it has more time to grow in the later combats as opposed to the earlier combats, so it's not that hard to get it to a reasonable size by the time you face Seraph, even if you only pick it up after Fel. The reasonable size will then probably only be 100 attack or maybe even 80 attack, but that's still useful. Still a 1 damage deal 80 attack, deal 80 damage spell basically, or you can even keep it around then. Anyways, Bounty Stalker, top tier card, definitely pick it up if you see it early. You do want to make sure it dies, you do want cards to reform or give it endless, and you do want Intent on Death to make it reach the full potential. But even if some of these things are lacking, it's still very strong. Next up, Devourer of Death. Devourer of Death is another tomb unit, same 1 cost, 1 capacity, 0-5 stat line as all the other tomb units. This one has a harvest trigger though, and the harvest is gain soul 1. Now what does soul 1 do? Nothing by itself. It has extinguish, deal damage to enemy units equal to 50 times the soul count. So for every unit that dies on its floor, it stacks a soul, and then once it dies, it will release all the souls for 50 times the soul damage to the whole enemy floor. That can be quite a lot of damage. It does require 1 capacity, and you will usually set up Devourer of Death all the way to the back, so it only dies in the boss combat. It is very useful with Intent on Death, which can trigger its extinguish early without it dying. So after a bunch of units have already died, let's say it has seen 6 units die, you play Intent on Death on it, it deals 90 damage to the whole enemy floor, killing all the backline units and weakening the frontline units a lot, so it can get even more souls because a lot of units will die on this floor. And then finally, when the boss comes around, maybe it has 25 souls in it, so once the boss kills your floor, it will deal a final 375 damage to the boss, which is pretty good. It does take 1 capacity though, so it will take a little bit of room to from your actual killing units, so it can sometimes be hard to use. But if you do require a high burst of damage against the boss, or if you do have Intent of Death, then Devourer of Death can be a very powerful unit. Just keep in mind, Soul is a buff. Soul can be cut in half by the Seraph, the Diligent? No, Diligent is the spell consume Seraph. It can be reduced in half by the Cleansing Seraph. And for that reason, it's not that great if you are facing the half your buffs Seraph. And it's also not carried over with Reform, so usually reforming a Devourer of Death is pretty bad. Usually most used as a boss kill behind your main floor. And it can be pretty good in that role. Next up, Big Sludge. Harvest gain rage 2. We talked about the other harvesters, especially Wickless Baron, gaining more health than attack. This one is all about gaining that attack. Now, Rage 2 means 4 attack. For every unit that dies, it will lose 1 rage a turn, but if multiple units die on its floor every turn, it can stack up rage pretty fast. This unit has the potential to grow out of control over the course of a battle, but it is a 2-cost, 3 capacity unit that only starts with a stat line of 10-30. So it does require a lot of help. Something you can do with it is play it in Umbra as your secondary clan and feed it morsels. The morsels provide the defensive values by giving it health, giving it damage shield, giving it lifesteal, and the harvest provides the offensive power it needs by giving it rage. If you use it that way, multi-strike is definitely a great way to go about it, while multi-strike is great on the Big Sludge in any circumstance. Um, Other than that, if you use it as a frontliner with morsels, it might be good to give it a hard stone or a large stone potentially. Large stone will mean it will have fewer capacity for morsels, but it gives a lot of extra health, so that might be worth the trade-off. But if you want to use it as a frontliner, it definitely needs a little bit more health. Also, unlike the Wickless Baron, which will keep the stat gains even if you reform it, Big Sludge will not, because all of its stat gains are from rage. So keep that in mind. Big Sludge is only good if it actually stays alive, if it can survive and grow and be a big chunky hitter, because it can grow really big. But the recapacity size of it can make it a little hard to use. Next up, Formless Child. Formless Child is a 2-cost tomb unit with 0-1 stats as opposed to the usual 0-5. It's still 1 capacity, but its extinguish effect is immensely powerful. The extinguish is return a random defeated unit to your hand and enhance it with plus 40 attack. Plus 40 attack is insane. Put that on a multi-striker and you're good to go. Something like an Animus of Will, a Hornbreaker Prince, or even a Draft, after it has been revived by the Formless Child, is gigantic. Now, Formless Child is a little bit hard to set up because it brings a random unit back. You usually want to hold off on units that die early if you are aiming for a specific reform. But a good way to ensure you get the right unit is to just play the unit on the bottom floor and the Formless Child directly behind it, and set up your other units on a higher floor. That requires that you draw the Formless Child early, of course, but if you do, that can be a very powerful setup. Put something like a Hornbreaker Prince with multi-strike 4 and the Formless Child on the bottom floor. Hornbreaker Prince dies, Formless Child dies, brings back the Hornbreaker Prince with plus 40 attack, and suddenly the Hornbreaker Prince just destroys everything. So something like that can work out, and because it enhances with attack but not with health or burnout, and also not with 0 cost, unlike the reform, the Formless Child is more often used with non-melting remnant units. Something like an Animus of Will or Homebreaker Prince, as I said before, can be very powerful to bring back with the Formless Child. But even if Formless Child brings back a Dragor, yeah, just a drag, that's still a 94 attack unit. Sure, it requires some upkeep to keep alive, but just for that reason, because any unit brought back by the Formless Child will be a valuable DPS. Formless Child can be very good, but it can be hard to set up with the 2 cost, it having to die, and it bringing back a random unit. So for this reason, I will sometimes pick up Formless Child, sometimes not. It depends a lot on how many good targets I have and how easy I think I can set up a beneficial Formless Child. Keep in mind it's also a very strong reform target. If you reform it, it becomes 0 cost and it will guaranteed die eventually to the burnout, especially after the first reborn reform, it will die immediately after and trigger its extinguish again. And of course, if you have something like Intent on Death, you can just keep using these on the Formless Child and give everything that dies plus 40 attack and bring it back, which is very powerful of course. So Formless Child, a powerful card that requires quite a specific setup to be used optimally, but is still not terrible even if it brings back just something random. So definitely an interesting card to pick. And finally, there's the Legion of Wax. This is my favorite card in the game, because it has so many possibilities to make it work. I'm not saying it's the strongest card in the game, because I think it's not the case, but it's definitely a very fun card to play with in my opinion. It's a 2 cost 4 capacity 8/8 stat line unit. Well, its ability better be great. Extinguish. Summon 2 Twins of Wax. Enhance them with all enhancements and card upgrades on this unit. Now, what is a Twin of Wax? A Twin of Wax is a 2 capacity for 4 units. With Extinguish, summon 2 Mode of Wax. Enhance them with all enhancements and card upgrades on this unit. And finally, a Mode of Wax is simply a 1 capacity 2/2 unit. These Twins of Wax and Modes of Wax are also cardless, so they cannot be reformed or anything. Yeah, Legion of Wax, very interesting. It does give all card upgrades you got from a Merchant of Steel or from any events onto the smaller ones, to the Twins of Wax and finally to the Mode of Wax. So any card upgrade like plus 10 attack on the Legion of Wax will first be on the Legion, then it will be on the Twins, and finally it will be on the modes. So once the Legion has split into the smaller units, you will get a multiplication of all these card upgrades. Some things you can do with it are putting 2 Heartstones on it. That means it will be unbelievably tanky. It will have 58 health by itself, and everything that spawns from it will have over 50 health as well. So you can hide something behind them and make the boss combat incredibly long. And if you have something like a Tethys with spell weakness or frostbite behind it, then the Tethys will have all the time in the world to apply spell weakness and frostbite to the boss. Other things you can do is you can reform it a bunch of times. That's a bit tricky, but can work really well. If your first Legion of Wax dies, you have the 2 twins left over, but you can already reform the Legion of Wax. Put it on a different floor. It will burn out, and even the small ones will burn out. But it will give all the reform buffs to the small units as well. And then you can reform it again once the big one has died and put it on the final floor. And just keep filling all your floors with a bunch of Twins of Wax and Modes of Wax that grow in strength whenever you reform it. Well, every new ones you generate will be stronger than the ones before them. It can sometimes be a bit annoying to get rid of a whole legion of wax floor because there are so many units it spawns over time, but it can grow quite powerful this way. And if you play like 3 times Reformed Legion of Wax with 23 stats, that alone can often take out a boss, especially if you upgrade it with something like Multi-Strike. Then other things you can do is you can trigger a lot of harvest triggers. Maybe you have a Legion of Wax on your floor and you play a big sludge and drip fall it onto the floor, and then the big sludge can see all these small wax, uh, modes of wax and twins of wax, and the Legion all can see them all die and get a lot of harvest triggers that way. There are a lot of ways to use Legion of Wax in very creative ways, and it only gets so much more powerful if you have Intent on Death or the artifact that doubles your extinguish effects. It's very important to get some upgrades onto it. Large Stone is great if you want it to be combat capable by itself. Hardstone is great if you want to hide something behind it that needs to survive a long time in boss battles. Harvest triggers are fun as well to hide behind it, but maybe then you want it to die quickly and want to put something like a Wickstone on it and give it burnout. Anyways, Legion of Wax allows for a lot of creativity and can amplify the effects of your card very well. It can even eat morsels or take buffs like something like steel enhancers or razor sharp badges from the Awoken and multiply these buffs when it dies. Anyways, it has a lot of users and you can be very creative, and most decks can find some way to use a Legion of Wax, and I probably picked this card a little more than it actually deserves, but it is my favorite card after all, and I really like breaking the game with it. Still, all in all, if I want to try and give an objective evaluation of Legion of Wax, it does require some setup, it does require some upgrades before it is actually great, but it can carry your run on its own with the right upgrades, with some reform or some buffs or something to hide behind it and benefit from the huge tank it provides. It's mainly a boss killer because it does take some time to spawn the little ones, and these little ones are then usually the ones that deal the most damage, just because all the enhancements and upgrades are then multiplied by the number of spawns you have out. But it's a very good boss killer in my opinion. You will be surprised how much damage a Legion of Wax can deal with bosses, and how often a Legion of Wax on its own is able to kill a boss. So that brings us to the end of the card review for the Melting Remnant. Let's take a look at their artifacts. So Melting Remnant has 10 artifacts as every clan. Let's start with Combustible Wax. Combustible Wax grants +3 stacks of burnout each time it is applied. Now this, each time it is applied, can sometimes be a bit hard to understand, because it doesn't work if burnout is enhanced on the unit that already has burnout. It only works if it's applied in battle, either by the card creating the unit having burnout. So if you play a drag with Combustible Wax, it has +3 stacks of burnout, so 5 burnout. Then if you reform set a draft, you enhance it with +1 burnout, you don't apply burnout to it, so it will only have 6 burnout the next time you play it, because it has 3 by default, and then when it comes into play, the Combustible Wax makes that 6. Cards that apply burnout to your units, like Wax and Spike, like Purifying Cleanse, or like Wicked Blaze, will work with the Combustible Wax to uh, increase the burnout they gain from that. So most of these cards will then apply 5 burnout, Hello Drippings will apply 6 burnout. Lady of the Reformed is will apply an insane amount of burnout to your whole floor, because whenever she takes damage she will apply 4 burnout to everyone. So all this technical talk about combustible wax, let's think about what it actually is useful for. So combustible wax has 2 effects basically. One is it makes your burnout units require much less attention. That is definitely a good thing. They are much less likely to be in a boss combat with a low burnout counter and just die to the burnout early on, because your cards that apply burnout will just keep them up for that much longer. It makes the Rector Flicker with burnout, the Burn Bright path, much more easy to play, and you have more time to find something to increase its burnout. So if you have heavy burnout, this card can help you a lot by making your burnout units require much less attention. On the other hand, it also makes it harder for your burnout units to die. So if you are reform heavy, you might not want to pick up Combustible Wax, because if your draft has 4 burnout before it dies the first time, then you might only get 1 reform off in the entire battle. So if you use reform as your stat scaling, Combustible Wax can actually be a problem, unless you have a good way of killing off your own units. Draft still has 5 health, so maybe you can just play it in the front line and having it die to the enemies with Combustible Wax. So it might not be a big deal. Lady of the House, on the other hand, with 6 burnout and 40 life, will probably a bit harder to reform if you have Combustible Wax. So definitely great if you build around burnout without much reform in your deck. It requires you to pay less attention to your reform unit and enables you to play other cards and spend your Ember on other cards instead. Which is definitely a good thing. Good thing. Then next, Encased Ember. Gain 5 Ember whenever a Tomb unit dies. This can generate a lot of Ember if you reform Tomb units from time to time, but most of the Tomb units are not that great. I mean, they are okay, but not amazing. And the Encased Ember can sometimes be a bit random when you gain the energy, because you might not always be able to kill off the Tomb unit whenever you want, especially if you have already reformed it 2 or 3 times. Then it might have too much health to die immediately, and all in all, it's a bit of a hassle to gain the energy, to gain the Ember from this artifact. On top of that, it requires you to have Tomb to have any effect at all, and as I said, most Tomb units aren't exactly great, so in many decks you won't include Tomb units if you have the choice. So I very often don't pick this artifact. A final thing that's a bit of a problem with Encased Ember is that the Melting Remnant itself is a very Ember light clan. Most of the cards are low Ember cost. Anything they reform will be free to play out. So oftentimes you won't have much use for the 5 Ember that this artifact gives you. If you do have a good use and you do have tombs in your deck that you probably plan to reform once or twice, this artifact might actually be pretty good for you. It can fuel X cost spells or other expensive cards or spells. But, in my opinion, it's a bit too much work to gain Ember from this. Next up, Exploding Candle. I think this is the best relic in Remnant heavy decks you can get. It deals 5 damage to enemy units whenever a burnout unit dies, so it's basically AoE. And it's not that hard to have a burnout unit die every turn in a Melting Remnant deck, because you can reform your burnout units. Many burnout units have low HP. You start with a bunch of low HP burnout units in your deck already with the Drax. So this is a very reliable source of AoE damage even. And Melting Remnant doesn't have too many ways to deal with backline units. They don't have great AoE cards, they have nothing like Vent or Glimmer, they have nothing like Spikes. Their only AoE spell they have is uh, Fatal Melting, and that's not only 2 cost, but it also requires friendly unit to die already. So Exploding Candle is a very strong artifact for them, just because it solves one of their biggest weaknesses, and it can even stack up quite a bit of extra damage if you have multiple units die every turn, which is not that uncommon. Next, another insanely powerful card, artifact. Flicker's Liquor. When you play a unit, a random card in hand is reduced to 0 cost for the turn. This can very often lead to situations where you don't really need your Ember at all. You play a 0 cost drag or 0 cost reformed unit, then it makes another card 0 cost, you play that card. It can chain onto itself because it can hit your other units and reduce damage cost. It allows you to pick up expensive cards like One Horn's Tome, for example, or even Shadow Siege, Consumer of Crowns, things like that. You can get them going with Flicker's Liquor. Just play your 1 cost cards first, then play a unit like a drag or something, and then the expensive cost will be reduced in cost and can easily be played. It has also some nice benefits with frozen cards from the Stygian. It does say for the turn, but if you freeze a card, you can actually keep the reduced cost around for a later use. That works as well. Oftentimes, if I see Flicker's Liquor, I will pick it and I will focus on getting more card draw, or maybe if I needed capacity from the boss relics, because with this card, you very often don't really need to care about your Ember very much anymore. And that's a very powerful effect for a single artifact. Melting Spout. Tomb units get plus 30 health. I hate this artifact. My tomb units need to die when I want them to die. If they have plus 30 health, they won't do that anymore. Sure, maybe with plus 30 health and a Hearthstone on one of your tomb units, you can get a 1 capacity tank, so that's not all that bad. But I don't think that's really a great way to go about it. Melting Remnant doesn't really have problem with providing tanks. 2 of the champion paths are already very good tanks. You do have expendable units you can use to block the damage and bring them back every turn. You do have a bunch of tank units as well, in the ladies especially, and even in the Wickless Baron. So you don't really need to give your tomb units plus 30 health and use them as tanks. But if you want to do that, I guess you can do it with Melting Spout. But I think it's definitely the weakest artifact. The second weakest artifact in Melting Remnant. Maybe even the weakest one. I almost always take the other artifact if I have a choice, and I often take 25 gold over it if I don't. Next up, Memorial Fund. Gain 5 gold when a friendly unit dies. This is quite a bit of gold. You can easily get 5 to 10 friendly unit deaths in a battle, maybe even more. in Remnant alone, and if you pair it with Umbra, then you can easily get 20 plus. And if you get 20 plus unit deaths in a battle, this is a lot of gold. If you see it early in an artifact shop with Umbra as your second clan, or just with a heavy reform strategy, you can pick it up. It will usually pay for itself and generate a bunch of gold on top of that. But I don't often buy this artifact in shops, just because very often I want the artifact I buy in shops to provide power to me immediately. Memorial Fund will not do that, but I am very happy to pick it up from a chest if I am playing with a reform heavy build, and sometimes I will even buy it if I am playing Umbra as my second clan. So I think it's pretty good. If you have it, try to maximize unit deaths. If you're not going for score, maybe kill the boss on the top floor so you have more time for units to die. Maybe play some units in front of your killing floor so they can die before the boss dies, just to get a little bit more gold out of it. I think it's a fine artifact and nice to have. Next up, Mold Braces. Friendly units gain Extinguish, apply armor 5 to the front friendly unit. I think it has relatively low impact, but it does make your units a little bit stronger. Once again, it synergizes very well with Umbra, because any morsel will add 5 armor to the unit that eats it, which is amazing. If every morsel has an additional plus 5 armor tacked onto it, that's great. In Molten Remnant itself, though, it's usually not that powerful. But if you do have some burnout units behind your tank, then when these units burn out, your tank will gain a little bit of armor, which is nice, but nothing crazy. You can also jump block with like tombs or drags, and then the unit behind those jump block units will gain some armor. Maybe it helps a unit survive the attack if it has enough units in front of it, granting it armor, granting armor to the unit behind it. So something like that can work, but all in all I think Mold Braces is a rather weak artifact and doesn't have an amazing impact on your game most of the times, but it's just nice to have. Basically similar to Memorial Fund, a nice to have artifact, but nothing usually game changing unless you're playing Umbra. Next, Resin Block. Now this is probably the third really powerful artifact in Remnant after the Exploding Candle and the Flicker Slicker. Whenever a friendly unit dies, enhance it with plus 10 attack. If I am playing a full reform based strategy, then I will love Resin Block. I will very often take Resin Block as my first relic in the run if I see it, unless the competing cards are Flicker Flicker or Exploding Candle. The Resin Block can just scale your units so quickly. Let's think about a draft unit. It's a 10-5 multi-strike, burnout 1. Over the course of a combat, you maybe reform it 3 times, so it will usually be a 25 attack unit by the time the boss comes around, dealing 50 damage in total with the multi-strike. With Resin Block, it will gain an additional plus 30 attack over that, because it died 3 times, you brought it back 3 times. So it will have 55 attack and deal 110 damage each round of combat, which is a lot more. This can add up so much damage to your units. It's very powerful. Even just a drag that dies once and is reformed with this thing will have 24 attack, which is pretty respectable. And for these reasons, I like Resin Block a lot. It's just a ton of extra scaling you get out of your reforms and even out of your endlesses. If you have Resin Block, you might want to consider putting Endless on a draft, so we can die every turn, come back, die, come back, and increase its attack by 10 every turn it does so. The only problem then becomes that for relentless combat you might want to keep it around for more than one turn, so you need some way to increase its burnout or maybe remove the burnout entirely with Wickless Recruitment. But if you have tools like that, then Resin Block plus an endless uh, draft can become a very powerful damage scaling engine. Next up, Votive Key. Waxer units gain endless. Now, this artifact has a really big problem associated with it, and that's the fact that you start with 3 to 5 Waxer units in your deck that have Burnout and don't want Endless. Usually, having Endless on a drag is terrible. Drags are expendable units, you want to get them out of your deck so that you don't draw them anymore, and while you do that, you gain a little bit of benefit from their stat lines, especially early on. Later, they might even be hard to fit onto the board. You might remove them, but if you have Votive Key, you really need to remove them, because with Endless and Burnout 2, these will be stealing your draws. They go to the top of your draw pile, and you will be forced to draw them again. That's not great. Also, quite a few other Waxer units don't really want Endless. Draft, in my opinion, doesn't want Endless unless you have Resin Block. Ladies don't want Endless, but it's also not terrible for them to have Endless, so it's not a big deal with these. But all these units, all the units with Burnout, are Waxer units. So Votive Key prevents you from reforming them because they go on top of your deck. So if you want to have any reform action aside from your champion, which isn't the Waxer unit, then Votive Key will ruin that for you. If you still have tracks in your deck, then better be careful when you play them, because they will go to the top of your deck as soon as they burn out, and they will waste your draws again. For that reason, Votive K is very weak in most situations. Now, it does have a few applications. There are a few Waxer units that are pretty good with Endless. One of them can be Legion of Wax. It's a bit difficult to make it work with Legion of Wax, but you sometimes do want Endless on your Legion of Wax. If you have something like a Large Stone or a Multi-Strike on it, then Endless on it might be actually fine. Or even Wicks Stone, but then you might instead want to reform it. Other than that, most Waxer units really don't want Endless. If Bounty Stalker were a Waxer unit, that would make the key a lot better if you had Bounty Stalker, because that's the one unit that really wants Endless. Devourer even already has Endless, so in the end it only affects Draft, your Drex, Lady of the House, Lady of the Reformed, and Legion of Wax. And that's just not a very appealing artifact, because on most of these units the Endless is actually bad. So I will admit, I have not even a single time picked up a Votive Key. So maybe it performs a bit better in practice than in theory. But I just can't see it work out for you. Unless you have Resin Block and use it with drafts. That would be the only time I would consider picking up Votive Key. Next up, Waxer Snuffer. Extinguish abilities trigger an additional time. This has very high potential. It does synergize mostly with some of the weaker cards. Um, it does synergize mostly with the tombs. Entombed Explosive, Molten Encasement, Remnant Host. These become a lot better. Actually very usable even in the late game if you double their extinguish effect. Bounty Stalker is insane by its own, so doubling the extinguish effect on that guy is amazing. Same goes for Devourer of Death, especially if you trigger it with the intent on death, then you can double the damage it deals whenever you trigger it. It makes Votivary into card draw, and it makes Formless Child a lot more powerful, and it has obviously broken interactions with Legion of Wax, because not only will it double the amount of Twins of Wax the Legion spawns, it will also double the amount of Motes of Wax every Twin of Wax spawns. So your Legion of Wax dies, you get 4 Twins of Wax, your first Twin dies, you get 4 Mote of Wax. These all just fit onto a floor, 3 twins, 4 motes is 7 unit. Then once your motes are dead, your next twin of wax dies, and you get another 4 motes of wax. So in total, you will get 21 units out of a single Legion of Wax. That's pretty good. And just in case you happen to have Spike Driver colonies and haven't upgraded them to their final form yet, you can increase the amount of spike driver colonies you can get with the Waxer Snuffer, maybe even accelerate the rate at which you can get their final upgrade. So Waxer Snuffer makes many rather weak units actually decent, and has a great effect on some of the already very good units and makes them broken strong. So a very good card. So now let's think about the clan as a whole, how the champions work out with the card suit we have seen, with the artifacts we have seen, and how this clan works with other clans together. So the Burnout Rector Flicker does provide the huge stat line necessary to kill frontline units, can be a great tank, something that is already a little bit of a theme in this clan. You often don't really need him to be a tank, but his damage is very valuable, because very often you need to scale damage up first in the Melting Remnant clan by reforming your drafts, buffing them with some attack so they can actually deal damage. So Rector Flicker will give you time to get your engine rolling. The Accumulator is probably my least picked champion. It does have some uses, but it's more useful if you play it with other cards, because the backline units the uh, Molten Remnant has are very often burnout units that don't really benefit from a tank that can survive 40 rounds of boss combat, because by that time they are already burned out. He can still be a pretty decent boss killer just by himself, and boss killing is something the Melting Remnant clan isn't very good at, just because of the burnout mechanic, and the burnout mechanic is sometimes a bit uh, bit of a problem in relentless combat. And this Accumulator Rector Flicker, if he gains enough health, can deal with bosses almost on his own. Finally, the Dark Calling Rector is very good early on to have a source of reform, to make use of your drafts, of your drags, so they can actually be brought back and you can actually have enough power to face a boss. It becomes much weaker later on when you have access to targeted reform, probably upgraded with holdover, and then his random reform just isn't that great anymore and he falls off quite a bit. But by that time you might pick up a level of Burn Bright and have a decently statted unit with some burnout that reforms some units If you have targeted reform after all, you can bring him back if you want him back. So um, I very often pick Burn Bright if I can, Dark Calling if I don't have any reform yet early on, and later on probably drop out of the Dark Calling for a Burn Bright upgrade if I find it. Probably not for the first level of Accumulator because he just doesn't get enough stats to really do well in combat by that point. Some synergies with other clans. Well, it should be obvious which clan synergizes the most with Melting Remnant, and that is clearly Umbra, because Umbra has expendable units en masse. They have cards that produce multiple morsels at the same time. They have cards that grant capacity. Capacity is very valuable for the Melting Remnant clan because of cards like Wax and Spike, cards like Paraffin Enforcer, and cards like Lady of the Reformed that all benefit from having a single large floor with multiple burnout units on it. Another thing is that obviously with all these friendly unit deaths, Harvest is a lot more powerful. Memento Mori and Memories of the Melted and Fatal Melting are much more powerful cards if you have a lot of unit deaths. And Umbra can provide these to you. You can also reform morsels, especially if you have very random morsel generations. You might eventually want to reform the best morsels you have available instead of relying on randomly generated morsels. Once these morsels become big enough, they can even tank hits for your Gorge units or deal some additional damage by themselves. So that's another nice synergy between these two clans. With Stygian Guard, it's a bit harder to make it work, but what the Remnant has going for them is a nice amount of cheap spells. But that's about it, because the Melting Remnant relies mostly on units, bringing back these units. And the Stygian Remnant is a lot more about spells, so there are no real obvious synergies with these clans. You can obviously play Molded on your Incant floor, for example. Things like that do work, but I wouldn't go as far as to consider these synergies. Things that are really nice with Remnant, with Stygian Guard and Remnant combination are things like Subsuming Blade, which can deal huge damage with spell weakness. Same goes for something like Memento Mori. So if you manage to get these scaling damage cards of Remnant up, they do have some nice synergies with Stygian spell weakness. Other than that, I don't really see much synergy between those clans, so if I play the Stygian Guard Remnant combination, I will very often be heavy in one clan and use the other one's cards to support a little bit. For example, Stygian with incant and damage spells, and maybe have something like Engulfed in Smoke to protect my Stygian units. Um, or maybe a Subsuming Blade as a damage spell, or a Dripfall to stack more incant units on a single floor. Things like that. Or maybe I am bringing back drags and drafts and ladies and stuff like that, and use something like uh, Helical Crystallis to kill off frontliners, or Titan's Tooth to kill off backliners, while I am getting the power through my reforms, because that takes a while, so the burst damage from Stygian can actually be a viable asset. Next up is Awoken. Awoken Remnant doesn't have that much synergy as well. something like an Animus of Speed can be a viable reform target, and cards like Razor Sharp Edge that enhance stats on your units can be very good on cards you want to reform, especially on drafts because they have multi-strike. So things like that can help out a combination of these two clans. So this does work somewhat, but it's not the best synergy in the game. Still okay. Um, Awoken can also provide some healing for the tankier units that Remnant has, so it does work out. Hellhound, on the other hand, is a very synergetic clan with the Remnant. There are two reasons for that. The main reasons are imps. Imps are very good reform targets because they die easily and they come with great effects when you play them. So if you reform a fledgling imp over and over again, or maybe a impish scholar and bring back your powerful consume cards, that can be quite strong. Um, of course, if you include imps in your deck this way, then the other cards that care about imps become a lot better, and cards that care about unit deaths and harvest cards become a bit better. So there is definitely some synergy there. The other part of the synergy comes mostly from the fact that Remnant has a good multi-strike unit as well as a good unit with that scales with rage, so you can build something like a rage based deck and get some rage on your multi-strike units. Just make sure to keep them alive because rage doesn't last past reforms. It can also be great if you use something like a deranged brute or some of the rage synergistic artifacts with something like a big sludge. And of course the Hellhound also have a very strong Ascend spell in Hidden Passage, which you can use to overstack your floors, which can be nice with the Lady of the Reformed uh, Draft Paraffin Enforcer build or something like that. So there is definitely some synergy. There's also the synergy if you play with Hornbreaker Prince. He's a very good target to get back, to bring back with Reform, or even better with Formless Child, because he does scale very well with attack gains. So just something else I wanna talk about while on the topic of Melting Remnant is the general game, how the general gameplay with Melting Remnant looks, because I think there is sometimes a little bit of confusion. Besides the builds that are somewhat obvious, like you have a burnout floor with Lady of the Reformed and drafts and Paraffin Enforcers, and you buff them with wax and spikes, or you buff them with things like Wicked, not Wicked Blaze, Wicklash, things like that. These are kind of obvious for the most part. It's a bit trickier to play a reform deck. Things you need to keep in mind when playing a reform deck is use multiple floors. You can have your units die on different floors, um, because you are very flexible once you reform them to play them on a different floor. Just play the units where they are most effective, and most important, keep the boss timer in mind. So it's not a you with a reform build, you will be spread out, you will be over multiple floors. Uh, Maybe because you want your units to die, you might want to take damage with your units, so it's not a problem if the enemy units die over multiple floors and you have combat with them on multiple floors, because the damage you take might actually be helping you get additional power on your units. As soon as the normal waves come to an end, start to focus on getting all your units focused up on a single strong lane. fight the boss. Usually you want this to be the bottom lane for one very specific reason, and that is with cards like Molded or Sacred Wicks or something like that, you can bring back your units to fight again on the next floor. You can bring back your strongest unit with the Molded on the next floor and just have it fight the boss again. And that's a very powerful thing to do, because it means you don't have to be strong enough to defeat the boss on a single floor, as it is usually the case with most clans, that instead you can bring up the units you invested so much in. The single draft you reformed the most and got all these attack buffs on it, you can just bring him back with Molded and have it fight the boss again on the next floor, and if needed, even on the third floor. And that's one of the strengths of a reform build. It's just something you need to keep in mind. It's not easy to play because you need to keep capacity in mind. If you have too many units on your second floor, you might not be able to fit your best unit onto that floor to fight the boss again. And then if you bring back your best unit and then realize you don't have the space for it, then you might not have the ability to reform the unit again for the third floor or things like that. You need to plan in advance when where your units are gonna be on any given time. That is very important in Melting Remnant. So that was it from my side about the Melting Remnant. I hope I was able to provide some insight in how to rate these Melting Remnant cards that look a little bit more complicated, how the interactions of the Melting Remnant clan is, and how you can have synergies with your Melting Remnant cards and units with other classes. Abilities, what other classes bring to the table. And most importantly, improve maybe a little bit on that Melting Remnant unique playstyle of being on different floors, having your unit die, bring them back in at the right time, improve their power over the course of the fight that way. That's a very intricate playstyle with many moving parts, and I do not suspect that my guide alone will help you master will make you master that playstyle. It requires a lot of experience. But I hope I could give you some head start to that playstyle. Thank you very much for watching.